Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Leader Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing the human element of cybersecurity, plus other headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. The audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. And don't forget to check us out at DEInetwork.com for coaching, assistance, industry briefings, and peer-to-peer groups. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up Digital Enterprise Institute, as well as our sister organization, ERPA AI. It's the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members worldwide, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, an author, an educator, former advisor at EY and Accenture. Carlos, good afternoon.
Daniel, good to be back. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, my friend. And today we're kind of pivoting from privacy and compliance. We had a great conversation last week with Trent, former privacy head and compliance head at Amazon Alexa. And really wanted to double down on cybersecurity in wake of that Pentagon leak. But before we do, Carlos, any other headlines kind of catching your eye this morning?
Well, I think like a lot of us, I was kind of looking forward to the Dominion versus Fox trial and to kind of hear the testimony of what really would happen in the network during that tumultuous time. And I guess all parties decided that $1 billion or so was going to make the matter go away. But they have another one coming up, which is I think it's Smartmatic is the company that's suing Fox for $2.5 billion. I think another $1 billion they threw on top of it, and so that one's earlier along in the process. But yeah, I don't know if this is the biggest defamation settlement ever in the U.S., but it's got to be sort of up there, right? It's a colossal amount of money to not go to trial.
Yeah, I was shocked when I saw that there was actually a trial date, and this past weekend it was still seemingly going on as planned because there's too much to not have get put in the public spotlight beyond what it already has.
And by the way, it's not an inconsequential amount. I think I'm not sure, but I think the market cap for Fox is $80 billion. And so, it's not Apple. So it's a significant amount for them to be paying, like you said, to not have to put, of course, behind that, there's Murdoch, right, and all of those people. And for them, it's not an issue. But still, for the company itself, right, it's a pretty significant thing. And I think maybe also the signal of, hey, we don't want to put the anchors, and enough has come out as it is, right? If you're watching the story, that was... Yeah, I was surprised they sat a jury, and I thought this would have been over before, which now sets the game plan for Smartmatic, right? I would imagine that now they go to Smartmatic and say, okay, here's a similar offer, and we can just kind of move on.
Yeah, I'm sure they didn't want to set that precedent, which probably had something to do with it. But you're right. I mean, this thing getting dragged through the headlines is... what's $1 billion? Think of it as advertising budget, right? For credibility purposes. But I think it brings up the bigger issue that we've talked so much on this show about verifying information and credible sources. And I think even me, I've kind of said, hey, we need legitimate news organizations instead of these influencers and enthusiasts all over the web where you can't validate the authenticity. But maybe that's short-sighted to think that these major networks aren't doing the same thing. I mean, this was proof of what a lot of people thought of, and maybe not the only one to do it, but definitely takes a shot at the traditional paradigm of certain organizations are credible. Even take the banking thing from a few weeks ago, right? The old established legacy entities, are they always as credible as we think they are?
Well, look, I think you just made a really interesting point that I hadn't thought of before. There's an article in my inbox this morning in the Atlantic about influencers, and I think the title was something like, "Is influencing now a profession?" Right? Is that like a legitimate profession? And as you use that word, I think this interesting label to apply to people like Fox or on the other side, CNBC, because sorry, MSNBC, because they're influencing you not towards, let's say, truth, but towards a point of view. So, on all sides, what they're saying is, okay, if the idea in the past was journalism influenced you to accept what is an objective truth, that isn't what we have in these networks, right? They influence you to take a point of view. The election was stolen. This person is a bad person, whatever it happens to be. So the defining media logic, right, of these organizations isn't to get to this is what happened on that day. It's to get to a perception or point of view of what happened on that day. So this isn't the facts; it's a certain interpretation of the facts, right? And I think we would have seen that very clearly had this trial proceeded.
Yeah, I think what's different too here is, we've all, at least those who, are newsies and follow this, you and I both have backgrounds in journalism. I think we know we saw the evolution from kind of, news to news entertainment and commentary and, 24-hour news cycle, editorial, what have you. But, the feeling was always, if you're conservative, you tend to lean towards Fox. If you're liberal, you tend to move towards NBC. And it's because you figured that was the slants of the news that they were covering. Now it's like, well, maybe they don't even believe what they're telling you, right? And so then how is it different, than, like you say, an influencer who's just paid to, endorse something that they may or may not like? You've heard all these things over the years of athletes that, got in trouble for, drinking Pepsi when they were endorsing Coke or what have you, right? I guess it's always happened, but we held our news organizations to another standard. So interesting stuff there. The other one that caught my eye before we jump into the cybersecurity was the head of the SEC who's testifying before a House committee last week, and started talking about crypto regulation, and apparently created all this uncertainty to the extent that Coinbase, crypto exchange, and others are thinking about, or at least threatening to relocate out of the US to, escape this regulation. So it brings up new questions about, we thought we were getting towards more legitimacy with crypto and blockchain. And now some of these guys are saying, forget this, we're going to go out of the US. And then, does it set us up for more FTX situations?
Well, look, you've had, I think, what's called jurisdiction shopping, right? It happens, especially with tax. So you've got companies that will go and say, okay, I'm going to put my headquarters in Ireland. I'm going to put it in here because, and then you do all these kind of machinations to sort of minimize your tax profile. This is jurisdiction shopping from a regulatory perspective, and it doesn't surprise me because the innate ethos, right, of crypto was anti-regulatory, right? The whole idea, it's sort of the nature of this is anarchic to a certain extent, right? It rejects regulation kind of a priori. So it's going to have a hard time if it accepts the SEC, Treasury, so on and so forth, because it really goes against the very nature of what this thing is. And so once you accept it, then it's just another type of money, right? Regulated, it becomes a currency like everything else, and that's goes against the very nature of what this thing is. It was always supposed to live outside a regulatory framework. Now, the question is that a realistic goal eventually? Or are you going to have two models, right? We've got, like you do with other kinds of money, right? The kind of regulated crypto and then unregulated crypto sitting in the Cayman Islands and, placed by different set of rules. That's my prediction. I think this is the idea that they're going to leave. There's too much money to not leave. So I think what you're going to want to find out is you're going to have kind of regulated crypto markets, and then call it, right, the deregulated ones that will exist outside of the US and for whatever purposes those are going to serve.
Yeah. Interesting.
Which you have with the regular banking system, right, Dan? You've got normal corporate structures that operate and are regulated, and you can go set up a company in lots of different places where people don't ask too many questions. We're going to probably wind up with the same thing here. It tends to be the model of financial services.
Yep. So let's get into the main story, which is, the wake of this Pentagon leak and what it means. And obviously we're going to talk about this from a tech and cybersecurity standpoint. But, two numbers that, you shared one of them with me before we jumped on, Carlos. And the other one that I saw this morning was, according to an IBM research report, 95% of security breaches are caused by human error. And the other one is that 82% of hacks are human created or human, driven. So, the thing that kind of jumps out, in this thing is, despite the fact that Russia or China or probably others are trying to hack us every day, electronically, it remains the human element remains the big challenge here, right?
That's correct. And what's interesting to me is getting ready for the show. I did a lot of reading this week, and one of the things I read was the Verizon. Verizon does an annual infosec report. But going through the Verizon report, that's where the 82% number came from, right? Which tends to sort of fall into three categories. You got phishing, you got pretexting, and BEC, which is business email compromise. But what's fascinating is that 82% of the problems, right, come from people, and yet in this long report, there's probably a page out of 100 or so that deals with this issue, and it's not very helpful. Not because they didn't try, but because most of these reports are sort of like this. So if you look, at least to me, if you look at the cybersecurity created literature on this, everybody will say it's 80%, 90%, whatever it is, but there isn't a lot of answer to that problem. And looking at some of the research, I came across a really interesting study that was done by a team led by Dennis Galetta at Pitt, and they took a very different approach in looking at this issue. They said, okay, um, let's look at it from the lens of healthcare. So did a study that I've reviewed where they use something called the EPPM, which is the extended. Uh, uh, let me see here, get it right. Yeah, extended parallel processing model, and it's something that was developed in healthcare, I think in the 90s, to look at, let's say, why somebody gets a pack of cigarettes and it says these cigarettes will kill you, and yet they keep on smoking, right? Or someone who's told, listen, if you drink too much, you're going to wind up with, cirrhosis or whatever it is. And what the model says is that when people are given a threat, right, or some sort of risk, they look at it in two dimensions. One is the severity of the threat. Is this like an inconvenience, or this is going to put me right out of commission for good? So how bad is the threat? And then, but the other dimension, which is interesting, is efficacy, which means how much power do I have with respect to the threat? And so what they found was that if you increase the threat level, but you don't increase efficacy, what happens is people assume there's nothing they can do about it. If you continue to decrease the threat, you actually get negative behavior. Or they'll
Mm.
say, this is inevitable. I'm going to die from drinking, so let's just get it over with, right? And when the team from Pitt looked at cybersecurity, they said the same thing is actually happening here. If you um, increase the threat level, right, or the risk, or the fear of cybersecurity, but you don't increase efficacy, what has people say, well, what's the point, right? They're going to hack us anyway. Or if I don't compromise, somebody else will. If I don't fall for the pretexting, somebody else will. So I think a lot of the issue is, from my own time in corporate world, was that there's a lot of effort made on one dimension of EPPM, which is pointing out how terrible it is if we get hacked. But the other dimension, every dimension, isn't well understood, I don't think, in cybersecurity by a lot of people, and it's kind of the neglected. The other point I make is that they talk a lot about in the study about a tipping point. And they make this very interesting point. They say often in cybersecurity literature we think of non-compliance as the opposite of the absence of compliance, and their theory is that's not the case. Non-compliant, it's its own distinct phenomenon, right? And the research doesn't look at it that way, and they do. So it's not about why is compliance missing, but why is non-compliance present? And that's when they sort of introduce this EPPM conversation.
Yeah, I spent a little time early in my career, in the tech space from the standpoint of working in tech and selling and running tech companies and things like that. And cybersecurity was always a tough thing to sell. Either security solutions for companies to invest in, or even the internal culture of selling people on doing things that they felt would slow them down or prevent, ease of access. We all hate when we have to, it takes us 10 minutes to log into something, right? We don't necessarily think about the consequences. It was and this is before, these major, hacks and data breaches and stuff were really even in the news. So, but even now, I wonder, what's if you're an employee within a company, how do you motivate that employee, to protect the company, right? Because at the end of the day, do they really care if company data is lost? They care about their day job, maybe they're 9 to 5 and they've got work to do and they want to do it as easily. I mean, you always talk to people, you see people, who would have like a really complicated password because corporate IT required them to, and then they had a post-it note on the outside of their computer with the password. And it's like, what's the point at that point?
I think you're seeing two approaches, right? Again, as I was doing the research, one is this kind of negative approach. For example, there are companies now that are doing, they call it like, let's call it cyber IQ, so secure IT score. And so employees are monitored and they're given a cyber IT score. If the score drops below a certain point, right, you're gonna get a call from somebody, right? And listen, you have to maintain this score, or you're going to get fired. You're going to lose your job, or you're going to lose your access to whatever happens to be the issue. And so you've got this, say, maybe something that swings from there's a benefit to having a high secure IT score, right? So there's a bonus, there's some other thing that you get because of that, right? And then there is the negative side of this. So there's that element. And then going back to the study, one of the things about EPPM that changes behavior is when you understand your role in the big picture, not simply as rules, but take away the rules, right? But say, this is the importance of the function you play. And it reminds me of, I had a chance to meet the former head of HR at Netflix. And she mentioned how, when she was at Netflix, they didn't have a vacation policy. They didn't have an expense reporting policy, right? Their expense reporting was use common sense, right? It was a one, and she said, vacation, take the time you need, right? So they had these one sentence policies, and it was a conversation between, right, between the employee and the company that said, we trust you. You're not going to go to a strip club and expense a strip night, right? Because you're not crazy. And if you were, you wouldn't work here. And so I think that there's this sense of, hey, forget the rules, forget the regulations, right? This is the role that you play within this structure that keeps the company safe and sound, which ultimately protects your job and your income and your living. I think that's very different from, look at these 25 slides that you have to watch every quarter and make sure that you see this. And because if you don't, right, some terrible thing is going to happen somewhere out there. It has to be personalized. And then back to secure IT, that's an interesting one, right? Where there is some score that says there's a benefit for getting a high in the score. Like I always joke that I think driver's license should be graduated by skill level.
Performance based.
Right, exactly. So if you're like me and you've taken all kinds of driving courses and you've paid a lot of money and invested a lot of time to become a very good driver, my speed limit range should be higher than someone who went to class when they were 16 and then they forgot about everything, right? And so I think performance-based driver's license is one of my other ideas. But for today, maybe there's sort of performance-based access, which is based on some sort of scoring system. And the technology apparently it exists there today.
I think the other issue with cybersecurity is that it's the security issue of it, right? I mean, I was reading the Discord, which is where the Pentagon files ended up being circulated initially. Came out with a statement and said, hey, we're cooperating, and this violates our our policy and all that. But it occurred to me that there's really no or what they said was that it's a little bit challenging to censor that because we don't have information from the government on what's confidential and secret, right? So the government's not going to come out and say, hey, this is what we have in our inventory. If you see it, let us know. And in the corporate world, you typically try to put a lid on those things when they happen, right? Because it becomes a PR issue, and a customer data especially is leaked. It becomes a major issue. So, how do you balance the, hey, if you see something, say something thing with, but don't say anything outside of the company because we don't want this getting out.
And by the way, the Pentagon thing wasn't a hack, right? It's something called privilege abuse, because this young man, he had the privilege, right? He had the access. So this is a different thing. It's when somebody who accesses information in a perfectly legitimate way then shares it or uses it in a way that's not supposed to be right the case. And so that's a human psychology question, right? And then you get into things like behavioral monitoring, which is another thing, right? It's thinking about like the security models at airports, right? For a long time, famously, the Israelis would use behavioral monitoring. They were agents that walk to the airport and they sort of look at you, and there were certain traits that they would observe, and that sort of tipped them off. So it wasn't a hard and fast uh, line that you couldn't cross. Of course, those existed, but the idea was the much higher order was I was skilled enough to notice that because you're acting in a certain way, you suggest that you may be a problem. I think we have that already in certain organizations in IT, where if you try to access a server, right, that you have no reason to be accessing, okay, that's trigger one, and so on and so forth. And that might be uh, something which then addresses this issue, which is really privilege abuse, right? Maybe it's possible that this guy was accessing files that he really didn't need for the job, right? Which I can imagine, or at a frequency that was higher than he needed for his job. And in another context, that would have triggered, why are you going to this, right, repository 3 times a week when everybody else who works in your division goes 1 time a month? So
There's that, and then there's just the, sometimes I think we overcomplicate these issues to say, we have all these, you mentioned a few here, and I didn't even know them, and I'm in the tech space, right? The crazy part about the Pentagon is he took pictures with his phone.
yeah.
I mean, how does this still happen? And one of the articles I read from Bloomberg was a retired Navy admiral, a former Supreme Allied Commander from NATO. He had a piece in Bloomberg where he's saying, how does this happen again? I mean, in 2013, you had the Edward Snowden thing. And it's like, well, have we not progressed at all in the last 10 years to stop? I think that was a USB drive. Now you still have people walking into government buildings with phones and taking pictures and leaving with them. How does that, I mean, we're worried about banning TikTok, which is maybe valid, but this guy didn't have TikTok. It wasn't China listening. It was, he snapped some photos on his phone. I mean, it doesn't get too much low tech than that, other than Trump and Biden and Pence taking papers in a folder in a brown box and taking it on vacation with them, right?
You assume that if you're the president, right, or vice president, that there's a different standard there. I think the other thing that this Pentagon showed, in the reasons I did, was just how many people have secret or top secret clearance. We imagine it to be a small number, but if
I think it's like some old guys with generals or whatever, right?
right, and it's not just that he happened to be a National Guardsman, but as we know, right, if you think about the last half a dozen or so of these kinds of leaks, they were contractors, almost all of them. Right? It was somebody working for a contractor. When the FAA thing, the ground halt, remember last year?
Yeah.
Right? That was a contractor. And so you've got a colossal amount of people who are given clearance. And it looks like what goes into that pool, it's pretty big. So part of this may be simply that too much stuff is going into this pool, right? So once you need a key to the pass door, yeah, you need the key to get into this room. But guess what? It opens a whole bunch of other rooms that you don't need to be in. And it looks to me like this is what's the case, that this guy maybe needed access or clearance for some particular role. But once he got that clearance, it allowed him to sort of wander the digital hallways of the Pentagon and kind of grab whatever he wanted to grab. And that's what I found interesting, is that the number of people who are cleared, and then there seems to be kind of a blanket clear, right? It's not top secret slash A or top secret slash B. Hey, you're top secret, so knock yourself out, right? You can go look at whatever you want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then the other part of this, which we've also talked about a lot, is okay, it's one thing if you're snowed in and you publish all this stuff on a website for everybody to see, because you want it to get out.
Yeah.
This guy didn't necessarily want this to get out. He put it on a private, Discord server. And so it brings up this whole, again, Web3 decentralized platform thing where, okay, even if you get Discord and, good luck with Twitter and all these other platforms to, look for this stuff and monitor, the more we go to kind of a decentralized web where people are setting up their own, corners, their own social apps and things like that, how long could this have gone on without us knowing, right? I mean, you look at some of the breaches that happen, they don't find out for 6-9 months afterwards, right? So how much damage is done before we find out?
And I think in the real hardcore hacking, right? You read stories about uh, a company, that's been hacked, but in such a low level way, right, that it stays beneath the surface, and people will park themselves for years, right, taking out CAD drawings and patents and these kinds of things, and they are smart enough to keep things at a level of activity that's very strategic. And so, the other question here is, you have this sort of zero trust movement, which I find kind of interesting, right? Which is a question I had one time at a CIO group, and I asked a dumb question, not being a tech guy, and I said, why don't you just start with the assumption that you've been hacked, right? What if you started with that nothing is secure? How would you operate differently if the basic, like, first principle was that there is no such thing as cybersecurity? It's a misnomer. It's an illusion. And when I say, I started laughing because that would be an interesting point of view. But it seems that finally, right, all these years later, you're kind
Going
of getting,
on.
it's called zero trust. And so it doesn't go as far as to say assume that there's no such thing, but it does sort of assume that nobody's trustworthy, right? And so you have to kind of earn that ability. So you can't do anything. Um, yeah, I don't know if that, you talk to more tech people than I do, if that's actually a thing now, or it's still kind of an outlying concept.
I don't know. I haven't seen it, too much, in adoption, but it's a very interesting idea because, back to you, like you said before, the psychology and what I mentioned about, it becomes a training effort, training and incenting employees to act a certain way. Maybe you just don't. I mean, it's like, isn't that you're more the health guy, but isn't that like how, well, white blood cells work? They kind of go through your body and like look, flag things that don't look like they're normal.
Well,
Right?
it reminds me of, there's a great scene in the movie Casino, right, where the great Scorsese movie, and I think it's De Niro's explaining to somebody how the casino works, and he says the dealer, right, the table boss watches the dealers, right, the pit boss watches the table boss, the floor manager watches the pit bosses, right, the other manager watches the floor managers, right. I watch them, they watch me, and so there is this zero trust model, at least in the old school casinos there, where everybody's being watched. Which again, you see, I remember watching Chernobyl on HBO, and there's a scene where the scientist meets the head of the KGB, and he tells him how he's being followed, and the head of the KGB points at two guys that are down the hallway. He goes, "You see them? They follow me," right? So we all sort of follow each other. Now it's a pretty grim world to live in, where if you say, okay, no one can be trusted, but maybe there's some benevolent version where you say, look,
Yeah.
you have to earn back that secure IT points, right? As your score gets higher and higher, that gives you the right, because we don't operate that way today, right? You get your VPN card or whatever it is you get, and then once you're either out or in. Once you're in, for the most part, you're kind of good to go.
Yeah, you've earned your way, right? It's like
Right.
TSA pre-check. We've checked, and you haven't bombed any airplanes in the last 10 years of traveling, so we think you're okay. But it doesn't stop the influence thing. It doesn't stop somebody from being radicalized and doing something malicious, right? I have mixed emotions about as you were saying that before, that zero trust thing and the pit boss thing. I'm just thinking, how do you avoid? You mentioned KGB, a Gestapo state, though, where there's like a group of people that they're following people around, and then if they don't find anything, they look for something because they're incented to find things, and then they find things. Or McCarthyism thing again,
Isn't that what you
communism thing.
have though? Again, you talk to CIOs more than I do, but isn't that kind of what already exists, right? You've got software that reads emails today. You've got activity monitoring. You've got firewalls within firewalls, right? So I assume if you work at a big company today, you think of your
Already that way.
as constantly under surveillance, and everything you're doing is being monitored by systems behind the scene that are gonna put up a red flag. Maybe it isn't that maybe it isn't that way at all, right?
No,
But
but it is. Well, it is in certain companies, or at least it was. I remember, one of our members who I became very friendly with, worked at a very large. He was a very senior guy within a very large investment bank. And he finally called me up one day. He goes, because I'd send him an email, say, hey, do you want to meet for a drink? He said, and he called me up one day and said, don't email me that. I said, what do you mean?
yeah,
He's like, they'll flag that email and double check it to make sure I'm not getting like, freebies from client or what, violation of policy, or if I, get fired, they want to fire me at some point. Look at all these emails. He drinks a lot, So I guess that's been happening. Maybe that benevolent thing that you're talking about is, it's just like, it's its own department. Or maybe with technology, maybe with AI, it becomes like this automated thing. Somebody told me, a number of years ago, it was parenting advice. They said one of the biggest parenting hacks is to make rules, tell your kids the rules, but don't be the one that created the rules. Make it like you're just following the rules. So if you tell them they can't do something, that's not me. It's just that's the rule. If you violate the rule, this is the consequence. But it's not, and apparently, at least until a certain age, they don't realize that you're the one making those rules up.
well, okay, all parents know, right? The worst thing to do is to say, "Don't do this," and then to do it yourself, because your kids will call you on it.
As I say, not as I do. Yeah.
But look, the maybe it is always going to be a kind of games of quote unquote cops and robbers, right? I remember talking to the CIO of a big consulting company, and just the number of attacks they had every day was astronomical. And he walked me through some of the cases they'd had. They'd had consultants who had set up a shadow company, and they were sending RFPs that were coming in, or they were forwarded it to their own sort of shadow company and responding both as the employee of the consulting company and putting in a counter bid against their own employer, right? Through their sort of shadow company. And he said, we find this kind of stuff all the time. And you're right. It's the question is, all right, are you, what is the psychological model that you're going to play? Which is why I go back to this study by Galetta and company. I think this issue just needs a different approach, right? Having read 100 cybersecurity reports over the years, and they all tell you the same thing. Almost all problems are human centric, and yet when you look at okay, where is the solution to that? There's nothing, or just about nothing. Then, for me, what I don't understand is why has an industry said, look, let's fund research that looks at this in a completely different way. Maybe healthcare, maybe it's not healthcare, maybe there's some other paradigm that can be to sort of think through how this should work, right? But
I think it's bad. I think my word of the year is incentives. I think it's like you said before, back to the proper incentives. If you tell people not to do something just
right,
because we said so, or you might get caught, that's tough. Or because the corporate Gestapo is going to come after you. I just think that's a tough thing to enforce. And I'm a big believer. Sorry to all my procurement and compliance friends here, but yeah, I'm a big believer. If you make rules reasonable, people will follow them for the most part. If you make things so difficult that people have to jump through hoops, they will create their holes. I remember a client years and years and years ago. he was trying to get stuff done within the organization. They were giving him all these limits. The CFO said, hey, you can't spend anything over, $10,000 at any single spot. So what did he do? He said, I had my client invoice me 3 times for $9,999, right? So what did that accomplish? Nothing. But it made it harder for the company to realize what was happening. It made it harder for him to do his job, and nobody won. Nobody won in this.
I go back to this idea of sort of the micro benefits, right? To your point, I think one of the things that would be interesting to look at from a research standpoint is, can you rethink cybersecurity so that it's a collection of human to human transactions, not human to system? And let me give you what I mean by that, right? 2 things. One is, I'm always to this day amazed at how traffic works, right? Because traffic, you think it would be complete chaos, but the genius of a couple of stop signs and a traffic light, and because of that creation, right, hundreds of millions of people move around the world every day, most of them without getting killed. It's simply, we have this mutual agreement with each other that when the light is red, I'm going to stop. And I don't know about you, but when somebody runs a stop line, a stop sign, I lose my mind, only because I can't believe you broke kind of this social compact that you're supposed to pause there and go.
But it's not a mutual agreement. It's a government mandated agreement. If you get
Most
too
of the
many
time-
points on your license, they'll take your license.
most of the
You won't get
time-
insurance, right?
But most of the time, if you break that covenant, you're not going to get caught. And yet most people don't do it. And I'll give you another example. I was in Germany not too long ago. I was on the Autobahn. And so, one of my joys is to go to Germany and drive on the Autobahn. You're on the Autobahn and you wait for the dashboard, the 4 little lights, gray lines come on that says you're free to go, right? And it isn't just because the gray stripes come on that suddenly you drive like a lunatic, right? You're still, even though you could go as fast as you want to go, you're still cognizant there are other people. I need to be careful. I don't want to risk my own life and the people around me. And people in Germany drive with a tremendous amount of responsibility, I think, way more than here, which reminds me of an experiment that was done years ago where they took speedometers out of cars, okay, to see what would people do. If your car didn't have a speedometer, do you go faster or slower? Generally speaking, you slow down. You know why? The research found, because people overestimate their ability. And so since they've been told they can drive 70, they think they can drive 70. Once you're not sure, you then judge your own qualifications, and almost everybody slowed down when you don't have speedometer. Speedometers make people drive faster for the most part, right?
I had the same thing when I was in Italy for the first time driving, and I didn't have my kilometers to MPHs in my head. So I was driving. Right, I'm typically a fast driver. I was driving slow. People like passing me. I'm like, what's going on?
It's like the first time I went to racing school and came back terrified because I'd seen real drivers and what the skill level they had. And I realized I don't know what I'm doing. I was going 45 miles an hour everywhere because I was terrified. I suddenly realized how much skill I lacked. And so there might be a way of thinking about this in a way that says, listen, the protecting a password, right? There's a kind of social covenant within the company that we all observe, like when you drive to work, right? And it's not about that you're going to get caught or fired, but that these are the rules that keep this system, which by the way employs you and pays your salary, right, functioning. And then at the same time, if you do break those, right, you lose your license. That doesn't mean you get fired, but imagine being told, you know what, you don't have email.
You lose your privileges, you lose your perks.
Hold them to a high standard. Right. You're going to have to write letters and pick up the phone and call people for the next 6 months. It's like, because you
back to your expense example. That's a great example, right? We're going to give you a little bit of freedom with your expenses, but if we find that you charge that strip club, now you're going to have a limit. You're going to get X amount. The CFO is going to look at every single one of your invoice reports, and it's going to make it a lot harder for you to get your job done, right?
Right. So being told you're going to operate like it's 1975, right, for 6 months. Just the way if you can't drive, you got to ride the bus, public transport, because you got a DUI.
That sounds great, Carlos. I wish somebody would take my email privileges away. That sounds like a great week.
For me, I could uninvent one thing. Uninvent email. but because I think it lowered the cost of communication way too much. But imagine a CIO who says, you know what, you've lost your IT privilege for 3 months because you did whatever, right? I'm pretty sure most people, when they got them back, they would be very protective, right?
Yeah, and you don't want to be that guy who's like, "Oh, Carlos, can you send an email for me? I lost my privileges again. Can you drive me to the liquor store?"
Yeah,
Right?
well, this just the social shaming of,
Yeah.
oh, well, I can't email you because I lost my, I lost my IT
Maybe there's
license.
even a list, like those spam lists. You know, like the blacklist. Like, oh gosh,
I
Carlos is
have
on
to
the list
literally,
again.
I have to literally mail you a letter that'll be there tomorrow.
I like
And
that.
so maybe there's just
I told you it's the low tech thing, right? It's the low tech solution to a high tech problem. Carlos, speaking of high tech solutions to a human problem, well, how do we feel about AI as it relates to being the guardian? Is that the solution of, hey, we don't have to have the Gestapo, we just have this algorithm protecting us and
well,
enforcing
I
these
don't
rules?
see how
Or
we don't go there. And by the way, remember we talked about AI a few times ago, and I said we're going to get to the point where somebody will be selling ChatGPT to be implemented in a company. And then last week I read about Amazon doing just that. So Amazon's plan isn't to build ChatGPT. Amazon's plan is to build a ChatGPT kit, is from what I could tell, sell it to a company, and then they build their own Charlie, Jane, whatever it is, Alexa, right? And so, yeah, I can't imagine that, Alexa, but I said, I can't imagine that there isn't a collection of very smart people saying, look, how do we set AI loose right within all these systems and let it figure out where the issue is, and maybe it would have spotted right that, because one of the things that we know AI is good at is repetitive tasks,
pattern recognition?
pattern recognition at a very high level, and a level that would be incomprehensible to human beings. So maybe that is enough to stop the person who says, why are you taking pictures? Why is this image here, right, open for longer than it should be? So
And by
it,
the way, that works, right? So back,
yeah,
when I was doing the tech stuff, that was the one thing that started working. Is
yeah,
they basically gamify security, and they'd have these systems that would pretend to try to fish, in your email or get you to click on something. And then when you did, it would say, "Oops!" Slap on the wrist. Hey, Carlos, this is why you shouldn't have clicked on that. And it created that education awareness. Now you add AI to that, and there's no person being the bad guy. You have this thing basically being what some of these companies, I think even the government started doing, is hiring former hackers to say, okay, if you were going to hack this system, how would you do it? Right. But now you can do it at scale. Plus, you have the traceability thing again. So
well,
now all of a sudden you have a track record of what happened, in opposed to, the manual. I put these papers in a box and took them out the front door.
well, go back to your parent analogy a minute ago and imagine today cybersecurity or infosec, like in most companies, is me versus IT,
Yeah.
right? That's kind of how it's seen for the most part, right? IT can't let me do this. IT can't do that, right? And they're you try to read a website that's try to explain like, okay, this is what you got to do to get access to whatever when you're traveling. Forget it, right? You give up. But now, 5 years from now, it's not IT, right? We've let loose the bot, right? And this thing that roams the digital hallways, it stops you and asks you, what are you doing? It's not IT anymore. I think the future is not IT cybersecurity. I think it's exactly what you said. There will be a cyber AI, and it will roam the hallways, sometimes nicely, sometimes not so nicely. Sometimes it'll try to trick you, sometimes it won't. And I think very much could say, listen, I'm shutting you down, right?
And then I think companies need to think about, again, the change management part of that is, what do you do with that information? Like Carlos, the AI automation thing stopped me
Right.
from expensing this. But Strip House is not a strip club. It's actually a steakhouse. So can you override this, please? But that becomes, to the zero threat thing, the exception to the rule, and stops the other 99% of the shenanigans, right?
And look, I think we see that future already in companies like Uber and Lyft, right? Because one of the thing that I, as a researcher, what I find fascinating about these companies is that they've replaced human middle management, right? They've built AI that manages the labor, right?
Yeah.
And they evaluate you, right? They score you. You got a complaint, talk to the computer, whatever it is. And so at Uber, you have already this tripartite structure where you have senior management, right? You've got the workers, and you've got an AI that acts as an intermediary between senior management and the workers. And it does everything, and it does more and more every day. And I think, right, like you see it with customer service, right? It refunds your money if your order is wrong, whatever. So I think where we're headed is exactly that. I think we're headed to a tripartite structure where you're going to have IT senior management, CIOs, CISOs, et cetera, right? You're going to have the average employee, quote unquote, and you're going to have an Uber-like AI structure that it will make the call, right? It's going to decide you've lost access, you have unlocked access. Now you're going to have the right appeal process and all those kinds of safeguards, right? But and of course there'll be issues. But I think you're exactly right. I would be shocked if 10 years from now we don't have a living, call it a living firewall,
Yeah.
right? And it roams looking at what everybody's doing, and can tap you in the shoulder and say, I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to go back to making phone calls for the next week.
Yep.
That's what you just did. So I would imagine that this might be, although you don't hear it as much yet, but I would be surprised if one of the most revolutionary applications of something like AI isn't in cybersecurity a decade from now. I think it'll look completely different. It's such a terrible system today that it seems ripe, right? This guy, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who, he wrote The Black Swan. In the book, they interviewed him one time, and he talked about, when I look at the future, most people tend to add things to the future, flying cars, right? Because I tend to take things away.
Hmm.
So my approach is, what's fragile, he said. What looks solid, but with the right change, cracks and falls apart. And to me, cybersecurity is a fragile system. And something will come along and the whole thing will collapse and completely replace what we have today. I'll be really surprised that isn't the case.
Well, Carlos, I think we solved another world's problem on the
Oh, yeah.
Digital Leader Show. So if anybody watching needs help solving problems, reach out to us.
Trademark.
We're here to help. And really interesting conversation, Carlos. Thank you. And we'll be back Wednesday again, live at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. And seriously, if anybody's looking for some help with anything that you're working on, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help. Carlos, have a great week, buddy.
Thank you. I was always run out of time. Do you think it's plenty of time that we could keep on going? Nice to talk to you again, Dan. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.